welcome to Sow and Tell.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
I'm Craig Hoover.
I'm Brian Wright.
And we are coming to you live from the TPUDC podcast studio here in...
live in West Haven.
That's right, live in West Haven. Actually, this won't be live. We will record this and cut it up and send it back. But nevertheless, we are alive and talking to you today. We wanted to take this time. We've got an interview with Jim Short. You will hear a lot of shorts because this is the Short family farm that is being turned into Armistead. I think one of the big questions that I think people will have is, well, if it's the Short family farm, why is it called Armistead? Mm. And this Jim talks a lot about that. We go into sort of the family tree, the history of the Short family and their ancestors and how they got here to Franklin, Tennessee. And it is really fascinating how ingrained in Franklin they are. I mean, if you all the names, right? It's the, Bennett Hardware and the Gray's Drug Store and Boyd Mill. And then of course, Armistead is another name that you'll see about. And he talks about the importance of that name, the importance of the family history as they went through this process and how they, and how we sort of arrived at this name and where it's going to go.
I think too, it's neat to hear about, where their ancestors came from and now, settled here, and thinking about all the people that will come to Armistead. And, obviously we hope that there are many, many people who are from Franklin, and even some who maybe come from across the street in West Haven over to Armistead and make that short journey to a new destination. But this project will be so unique and so special. We anticipate there will be people wanting to come here from around the country. And so it's kind of neat to think about people migrating here for this experience to live in Armistead as their ancestors migrated here to farm the land and do other things.
Yeah. I mean, so many people have moved to Franklin here in the last, 15 years, really. And I mean, obviously over the last 50 years, but in the last 15 years, we've seen a real explosion in population as Franklin's downtown has gained all this notoriety and the explosion of Nashville and whatnot. And it's just, it's interesting to see how that migration happened 250 years ago. Mm. And then how they came to settle on the farm here in the 1880s is when they finally bought this farm for a small sum that he will talk about. So thanks to Jim Short, who was actually down here just for the weekend. So we wanted to take the opportunity to grab him. Brian, you were out of town, so I stepped in and played the role here of interviewer. So it may be a little disconcerting, but we're going to wave a magic wand and Jim is going to pop up here in the Brian seat. So have a listen.
So I'm Jim Short, grew up as Jimmy Short here in Franklin. My dad, Walter Short, was one of the children that grew up on the farm with my grandparents. And so we grew up always referring to the farm as Westbrook Farm because that's what the name was when it was purchased. And the creek that runs through it is known as Westbrook Creek. But that's the farm, and our project is still going to have a farm on it, and that farm can still be called Westbrook Farm. But this is more than just a farm, right? We want people to live there, and we want people to shop there, and have family gatherings and all kinds of things, just like we had as a family growing up, celebrations during the holidays and the 4th of July and so forth. But we still wanted it to connect to the family, right? And so it turned out, when I called you that day and said, I have an idea, it wasn't like I had an idea. We'd been talking about it as a family, and family traditions are important. And so there was a name that had been in the family, actually, for the last 250 years. It was Armistead. And what's interesting that we learned when we think of the etymology of the word is that arm means strong, and stead means sense of place. And so Armistead is a strong sense of place. And that is exactly how we felt as a family would represent the concept of what we're trying to do.
Give the listeners a little bit of your Cliff Notes of why Armistead and who was Armistead and why.
Sure. Well, before we go back 250 years, let's start with just Westbrook Farm itself. And so in 1887, two brothers got together, Benjamin Franklin Short and Jesse Armistead Short. And they bought the farm. Bought it for actually a little over $9,000, which would be just under $300,000 in today's dollars. And it was just under 200 acres. And it's kind of shaped like a J, which is kind of important to this story because BF, who was the older brother, he and his wife, Tenny Boyd Short, were married, and they built a small clapboard kind of frame house with a picket fence, very farm-like. Think of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, kind of sitting out there. And then Uncle Jess, which was Jesse Armistead, he never married. And so he eventually came out and also lived in the house. And so they would just kind of add on to the house as the family grew. They had a son who was Jesse Short, my great-great-grandfather, who then later inherited the farm and lived in the farm.
Right.
So that's the first Armistead, if you're trying to connect it to the purchase of the farm. But if we go back the longer time, it dates back into Virginia in the 1700s, and it's when a man named John Atkinson married Mary Armistead. Well, it turned out John Atkinson was born in 1755, and a few months later, a boy named Thaddeus Armistead was born. And they grew up as best friends. They were only a few months apart, and they did everything together. And then later, John Atkinson married Thaddeus' sister, Mary Armistead, in 1777.
Right.
And he actually served in the Revolutionary War and for a short time, and then got shot in the hand and was sent home and deemed unworthy to fight anymore, and became a Baptist minister. And in the 1800s, around 1806 to 1812, the Atkinsons, along with the Shorts and the Boyds and the Carters and the Bennetts, all of our ancestors moved from Halifax, Virginia, to Williamson County. Right. And it was their daughter, Judith Atkinson, who married William Henry Short. And that was when and William Henry Short and Judith had several children, and two of them were these two brothers that bought the farm. That's the Armistead kind of lineage.
What was Williamson County like when you first came here? I mean, was it just
from the stories? So a lot of this information that I'm sharing, my grandmother is the source. She was the genealogist who did all kinds of the family history, and her daughter, my Aunt Mary Ann, has continued to be the family historian with all of the archives and the information. Right. And so when I would talk to my grandmother and Annie, it would be like, probably a dozen families moving to the area. And when these families first moved, they didn't settle in Franklin. Franklin was established in 1799. So this is not that far after that. So, streets are maybe laid out, a few buildings or whatever. Yeah. So when these folks moved, they moved to the hills more, and they built log cabins. And so and those log cabins still exist today. The Shorts built a log cabin out on Stillhouse Hollow Road, the Carters in Wildale Hollow, and the Atkinsons on Old Charlotte Pike.
On Wildale Hollow out on Hillsborough Road.
That's right. That's where the families originally settled, and then as Franklin, the town, grew, then people would start buying land and settling farms or moving into town and building a house and like that. And so with only a dozen families, you're going to find a lot of these families, overlap over the hundreds of years, and your relatives become like the founders of Franklin in the county and how it was early settled.
I don't think there's any kind of about it. I mean, it sounds like, if you're thinking they came here in the early 1800s, this was hardly anything here. And
that's right.
So I think that's so neat, and I think it's really neat that name, that the Armistead could start 250 years ago and move here, and then now all of a sudden I think if we're doing our job right, that it could be one of the sort of the more signature places in this city after so many different iterations of what Franklin has been over the course of the last 150 years.
Well, I was born in 1965, so my memories of Franklin are more like in the 70s and 80s. Graduated from Franklin High School in 1983. And And so, Frank, I would listen to Nanny talk about what Franklin was like when she grew up. She grew up in the Bennett house right off of Main Street. And my great-grandfather had a hardware store, Bennett Hardware, there in town. Mm-hmm. And she would describe Franklin like in the 40s and 50s. And then, of course, I think of it in the 80s. And now it's just like, it's very different. Things have taken off. And as the city continues to grow, Franklin is a sense of place, a strong sense of place. I mean, it has a very unique character. And as we move into the rural areas around the city, how do you preserve some of that rural character, but maybe also build a sense of place of what villages and communities used to be like, where you and your neighbors were really close, literally living close to each other, but then there was a lot more open space around where you lived, and you could sit out on your porch at night and see the fireflies coming out across the pasture and see the cows off in the distance, and kind of decompress from like wherever you were earlier in the day at work and everything else.
Right. I just remember early on we were talking about how, what you wanted to feel, how we wanted our residents and visitors and all that to feel. And that was one of the very first things you guys said was, I want to be able to sit on the front porch, look over the pasture, see the lightning bugs go and see a farm, and, hear the sounds of a farm, but yet with all the conveniences of being in Franklin, in this city. And I just keep going back to the fact that, all right, so way back when your ancestors or in this group of 10, 12 families that all sort of settled here, and that's kind of what we're doing right here. It's like, all right, well, here's sort of this last little, vestige of the farm, the farm lifestyle or the original farming that happened in Williamson County 250 years ago. It's like, I mean, this literally is the, one of the last, parcels of any acreage within the city limits that is developable. And so I just think it's really special how you guys have come together and said, all right, we want to honor our family, and yet still create a place where people want to move in, and as many people as possible can come in and experience it the way, in a new way, but experience some way how they did. Sure. And I just talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, about how your family went through those discussions, because this was not a new thought. We didn't bring you to this thought. This was your idea to begin with, or, your family's idea to begin with. Tell me about what was going through your mind and all that.
Yeah. Well, my grandfather died in 79. And I think at that point, the farm was put into a trust, and it stayed a working farm for 15 years. My Uncle Bud, continued to run the dairy operation and all that up until the 1990s. And I think as the farm operation started to dwindle down and we saw all this growth in Franklin, we would every once in a while wonder, like, what is going to happen to the farm someday? Mm-hmm. And we didn't want anyone to come in and kind of tell us what we needed to do with it, because we had a strong sense of place, because we all had our own family experiences there. Like we go out in the summer, and my dad would take me out on the weekends, and you'd help take up hay. Or one year I helped with a little bit of the tobacco, or you'd go there for holidays and so forth. And then when you learned more about the generations that had farmed the farm, the four Jessies that had farmed the farm, and how this was so connected to the history of Franklin, you thought, well, we want to be able to drive by someday and still see something that we'd be proud of, to show our grandparents, this is what your home became. And it was a gathering place for us as a family. So it became, how could this also be a gathering place for future people? And not just the folks that lived there, but to have a village and places where people can come and enjoy the space and have an afternoon at the farm. Mm-hmm. And maybe even be able to come and vacation there and stay at an inn and hang out for a while and enjoy the farm. And so all of those things became something that, as we learned more about what was possible, and when we found the right planners and developer and people that shared that vision, then we started like saying, oh, wow, this could really happen, and as we talked to people in Franklin about it, people have gotten excited about the idea that this could be a different way to develop rural parts of the county.
Yeah. Well, I just thought it was so neat, and it was so serendipitous, I guess, because of the backgrounds of Brian and myself, and then the family and the family's vision in this particular place, and it was just, we all just came together, and I just remember those early meetings. And you guys were shopping for developers at this point, right? Yeah. I mean, and those early meetings, there were just so many, just like everybody nodding and everybody saying, yeah, I think, because I could see almost immediately where you guys were coming from and what you were holding dear and what your, plans were. And to know what Brian had done in the sort of the agricultural neighborhood world, thus far, and me coming off South Hall, it was like, this really does feel right, and it's really neat, and I just think it's really neat that we've now come back around to Armistead, and we've launched this whole brand. So tell me how you guys are feeling about the way Armistead is starting to take shape as a brand, as a plan, and just give me your opinion on that.
So there were, you were talking about how we thought of this as a family. There were two conversations we had early on a few years ago. One was asking everybody in the family. So I'm one of 7 cousins at my generation, and then there's my Aunt Maria, my Uncle Bilbo, and Uncle Bud, who recently died. So we were in these conversations, and we asked everybody in the family at that time, what would be a win for you in terms of, if we did this right, what would you like to see it? And we also asked everybody, how long do you think you want to stay in this? Because you can do a one and done sale and be done, or you could stay in it for the long haul and shape it and kind of be involved. And believe it or not, there was a consensus that we all shared the same vision of what a win looked like, and everybody was willing to stay in it for the long haul, and not just do a quick sale and move on. And so that was a really important cornerstone of kind of like where we started. And then the other important conversation was, we learned about this idea of an agrihood. Mm-hmm. And I mention that to people sometimes, and they go, a what? Yeah. And I was like, well, like neighborhood, but just agricultural neighborhood, mm-hmm. agrihood. And they go, oh, well, what's that? And I said, well, it's like we're going to have a farm where a bunch of people live in their homes, and they're like, wow, that sounds really neat. Well, it turned out one of my cousins, Lee, had done some research, and it really was a thing. Mm-hmm. The Urban Land Institute had done a report on agrihoods. And so we started doing our homework and learning about, like, oh, so it is a thing to kind of think of a farm and people living there. Yeah. But it was a challenge to find folks that shared that vision. A lot of developers wanted to come in, and they knew how to build houses, so that's what they wanted to build, or they wanted to build a shopping center mm-hmm. type thing. And we were like, well, we like the idea of a village, and we like the idea of people living there, but a farm isn't just, let's put a few gardens around. Let's actually grow stuff and for people to eat, and enjoy. And maybe some of the shops in town use some of that produce and honey and milk or other things to develop products. And mm-hmm. so it's been a long conversation, but every time we turn a corner and learn a little bit more, we began to realize, like, oh, this could really happen. This is a thing.
Now, I personally was shocked. This piece of land is phenomenal. It's phenomenally located. It's flat. It just lends itself to a blank canvas for development, and it is. And we've obviously gone through quite a real estate boom here in town, and to hear that you guys were, unified and wanting to stay in this and be involved and take the long view. It's just amazing. We won't have to get into numbers here, but this is an extremely valuable piece of property. Everybody could have come out with a really big check, and no one in the family necessarily is already flying around on a Lear jet, and so it's like you guys were like, it's like no, I know we could have X now and go away, but it was so important to you guys to honor the land, honor the family, and then realize this vision that no one, to a man or a woman in the family, was just like, you know what, I'll just take the check. It's just it's amazing. Maybe I'm overly cynical, but when I heard that story, I was like, I was like, all right, these are people I would like to work with.
Well, you know, growing up, we used to get all of our milk at the farm. We would go out at least once a week and fill up a metal container and come home and put it in a pasteurizer, which basically was a heating element underneath and a heating element on top. It would heat the milk up to a certain temperature to kill all the bacteria. The buzzer would go off. You take it out, put it in the sink, cool it down, pour it into glass jugs and put it in the fridge, and then you'd have about a good inch of cream that would float, to the top, because it wasn't homogenized milk; it was whole milk with heavy cream. And so I grew up knowing at least where milk came from, and so when I was living away from Franklin in Colorado at one point when my kids were really little, Uncle Bud sent them a video one year for Christmas, and it was like, where does a peanut butter sandwich come from? And he said, I want your kids to know where their food comes from.
Right.
And so in this video, it showed the peanuts being grown to make the peanut butter, the strawberries being grown to make the jam, and the wheat being grown to make the flour and all that.
Yeah.
And so we grew up hearing all kinds of stories about our current relatives who were farming, as well as our grandparents who were alive and living on the farm. My Aunt Marianne tells a story about making butter. Well, I remember going out and my grandmother doing that with me and my sisters, showing us how butter's made, how cottage cheese made, how you get buttermilk. And, you talk to kids today and it's like you go to the grocery store, right? You go to Publix, that's where your food comes from.
Yeah, right.
And, and so I think there is a lesson there to kind of bring people a little bit closer to the land and have them experience it. So it was always in our DNA, I guess is a way to think about it. I was a high school biology teacher for a while, and I've continued to work in education for over 30 years. And so we see this as not just a place to live and a place to enjoy the shops and the restaurants and so forth and the farm, but maybe also some educational opportunities. I don't know how many people know how to take food from the garden and actually can it and preserve it and then eat it later in the wintertime. And so, or gardening classes about like how to grow things and so forth. And so all of that could someday be part of the experience at Armistead as well.
Yeah. We certainly hope so. Well, tell me this. Right now, you live in Connecticut, right?
Yes.
Now, you're going to have an opportunity to buy a place here in Armistead. Tell me where, of all the places that you've heard, where would you want to buy your place?
Yeah, my cousins ask me this all the time, and we live in Connecticut mainly because that's where my wife's family is, and so I'm not going to move back south. I know that for sure if I'm going to stay married to my wife, but I have two boys, and one of them went to college down here, Rhodes College, where where I met my wife, and so who knows exactly where we're all going to land. But if right now I had to pick a spot. I get excited about the idea of hospitality at this place because I love to cook. I get excited about the kind of shops. I lived in Brooklyn at one point, and Brooklyn is it's all about the neighborhood you live in. So there was a fish market, there was the vet green grocer, there was the cheese shop, the butcher, the wine store. And so when you went shopping, you didn't go to the supermarket. You just walked down the street and stopped at all these different shops on your way home from the subway.
Right.
And so building a village where you have that would be cool. But I want some place that I can come visit. But when I'm not there, it seems silly to leave it sit empty all the time, right? So if we had an inn with some cottages, and like one of those cottages was mine, and when I'm not there, then it could be rented out and used as part of the hospitality. But when I'm there, maybe I want to bring some friends that I went to high school with, or
they can stay in the other parts of the inn.
We could hang out there, and then we could enjoy the village, and then we could walk around the farm, and so because right now every time I come down I impose on my cousins and I stay with one of them. So it'd be nice to be able to say you had a place that you could come stay at the farm.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, is there anything else that
I think there's one other aspect of Armistead that we ought to share, and that is, you mentioned the work we did with a marketing firm. And so, as everybody knows, the name is important, but the brand is more than the name. And so we had to start thinking about, well, what's the logo?
That's
like,
right. The logo, right.
Yeah, and so again, we were very interested in building off some part of the farm, some
Right.
some aspect. And so when B.F. Short and Tenny Boyd built that original house in the late 1800s, Tenny Boyd planted crocuses around the house, and it's a yellow crocus, but it's actually a fall crocus. So it's a crocus. Most people think of tulips and crocus and hyacinth and all those things coming up in the spring or Easter.
Yeah.
This is actually one that comes up in the fall, and it's rather rare. It's not as common, and they are still on the farm today, down the sidewalk that leads to the house that my grandparents built. And so we started working with the marketing firm to kind of play with that concept of how would you kind of conceptualize something that was inspired by the crocus, but also maybe connotates growth and roots and growing things. And so they came up with something along with the word Armistead that we're excited about, that kind of represents a logo that's a sense of place, a strong sense of place.
I think it's I'm really pleased with with the logo and the name and everything, because Armistead is, like you say, is such a strong name. You know, it just evokes such strength and majesty almost. And then this crocus flower, which is relatively delicate. Like you feel it and you see it, and it's just kind of, you can feel like the wind might knock it over.
We were at the farm today, and I walked around the front yard, and there were about half a dozen of them in bloom right now.
Right, yeah, because we're recording this in early October, and they're still there, and then when you see the typeface, the way they went, they put Armistead in all lowercase, and with that flower on top, it was just such a nice juxtaposition, because it's both strong but also approachable and also organic and not and just not overly. And I guess I feel like that's what we're trying to create here, which is this. It's full of nature. It's full of strong family ties, and it's also a name that gives a sense of strength and sort of deep roots, and I think that's where we landed, and I couldn't be happier with it.
Yeah, and we're real excited about refurbishing some of the old historic farm buildings, and so that people that come to the farm can enjoy them. And one of the most majestic ones is the tobacco barn. It's what, 3 or 4 stories tall, and where the outside right now is looking like it needs a little help. It's a little long in the tooth, but you go on to the inside, and the rafters and the beams and everything that used to, where you'd hang the tobacco and let it dry out before you then pulled the leaves and then took it to the market to sell. And so making that like a Grange Hall or a gathering place for people to come and have events, whether that be a wedding or a small family event, I think it can be incredible. And it'll be a way to honor the fact that our ancestors built that and they used it, and now we're going to repurpose it, and future generations are going to use it for other ways to celebrate their life.
Yeah, no, it's going to be great. And that dairy barn can actually be, we probably won't be a full dairy operation here anytime soon, but at the same time, the dairy barn, which is just adjacent to the tobacco barn, can be the kitchen. So earlier we were talking with Miss Mary Ann, she was saying, she's like, well, that has to be treated like a kitchen, and they had the same inspectors coming. It's just ironic that 100 years later, the same inspectors are going to come back and be looking at that dairy barn, but a completely different use.
Well, in their story, they were talking about the milk being later sent to town to make cheese and so forth. Well, again, they're one generation. When I was growing up, and my Uncle Bud would talk about, they still would come out and check the milk, but if it met the highest grade, then it could become drinking milk. But if it lacked, not to the point where it needed to be thrown out, but it might be sold to make ice cream, because ice cream didn't need the quality of milk that drinking milk did.
Oh, yes, okay.
So there was all kinds of things you'd learn going out to the farm. One of my favorite memories was taking friends out, and when the calves are little and they're still being fed with a bottle or built out of a bucket, you can stick almost all 4 fingers into the mouth of a calf, and it'll suck your fingers just like
right.
But it was always the look on my friend's face as the cow did that, and then they pull it out, and it's all slimy and nasty and everything. But it's like that was part of farm life. But the one thing we probably will not continue that's part of that farm experience is the smell of a farm, because it was a dairy farm, and it had about 50 dairy cows. and it produced a nice aroma. And that's probably not what people want to smell living out there. So we'll focus more on growing things, whether it be flowers or vegetables and fruit trees, nut trees, all those kinds of things, and limit the amount of cow patties that are all over the farm when you have milk cows.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Well,
and
thanks.
Thank you for everything you have done so far to make this process be so enjoyable as a development partner, as planners, and it's just been great to get to know you and get to know the family, and I just look forward to the next half decade.
Well, I want to end with one last story, and that is, both my grandparents grew up in town.
Mm-hmm.
And so my grandmother grew up, private school educated, went to Vanderbilt, worked in the hardware store, lived in the Bennett house. My grandfather, even though the Shorts ran the farm, he grew up on West Main Street, and his father spent more time working at the bank than, managing the farm. And so when my grandparents married, they decided to go back to the farm. And they were not farmers in a sense. They had to learn, to be farmers. And my grandmother, the story was a better shot than my grandfather. She picked up cooking, washing, taking care of all the household stuff, but could also shoot a squirrel if she needed to. Right. And I even remember as a kid, she'd go to the back porch and put her fingers in her mouth and whistle, and the dog would come up, to get food and stuff. And this was the same woman who, grew up in a very nice Victorian home and had a cook in the house and all that. But when she married, she decided, no, I'm going to learn the life of living in the country.
That's right.
And so I think what's cool about this idea of us now building something else at Westbrook is to give people a chance who probably didn't grow up on a farm, maybe live somewhere now that's much more urban-like, and then they say, let's see what it's like to go out and live more in a rural kind of farm-like area, just like my grandparents did in the 1930s, and raised my dad and my aunt and uncles. And so that's what we hope for. We not only want to enjoy the farm and have our children and grandchildren enjoy it, but we want others to be able to come and enjoy that as a sense of place to experience, just like we did as kids.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Craig.
All right. Bye. Yeah, again, thanks to Jim, who was down here. He actually lives outside of New York. Jim and I talk a lot. We talk once a week, and he's my contact with the family and everything. So we talk quite a bit. He's looking forward to seeing this place come to life, because he did grow up here, and he went to Franklin. I think went to Franklin High, but grew up in Franklin, and is excited to see this place be what it is. And went to Rhodes, just like Bilbo from the last episode. So
it's interesting to me too to think about the number of good storytellers in one family.
I know.
It's like a storytelling tradition apparently, and so I think that's one of the things we'll try to bring forward into Armistead and make sure that heritage of storytelling continues on. And I'm not sure exactly how we'll do that yet, and if we need to design a little storytelling spot or whatever, but it seems like that's an important part of their past and hopefully the future.
Maybe we should have a literal family tree.
I like it.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Let's just have a tree that is a family tree, and we'll take the branches and we'll name them and we'll stuff.
Yeah. We'll do it like an espalier, so it's like you can shape it and make sure there's the right number of branches. And hang a little medallion on each one for the name.
Yeah,
that'd be really cool.
I think that'd be neat. All right, well, thank you. This has been a short episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will be back very soon.
See y'all.
Bye.